Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to today's webinar, Filling Known Collection Gaps in Libraries. I'm Brian O'Leary, the Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and we're lucky today to have Stephanie Anderson, who is with BookOps, an organization that provides critical services to both the New York Public Library and the Brooklyn Public Library, who's going to help us lead a conversation about how libraries choose books to add to their collections, what information could make that work easier for those libraries, and how improving metadata can help fine-tune efforts to fill known collection gaps for both libraries and their patrons. Stephanie's going to give you an understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that librarians face in working to bring a diverse range of books to library patrons, and how publishers can really work to improve visibility of their titles for librarians. So first, Stephanie, welcome today, and thank you for being part of this webinar. I'm looking forward to the work that you prepared for us.
Great. Thank you, Brian. You can hear me okay?
Yes, just fine.
All right, I'll go ahead and get started then. All right, so we're going to talk today about filling known collection gaps in libraries. And I want to set the context for this by reiterating what Brian said about who we serve here at BookOps. So BookOps is the shared collaborative technical services organization of the New York Public Library and the Brooklyn Public Library. For those who aren't aware, there are actually 3 separate library systems in the city of New York. I work for 2 of them. These are my 150 branches. I manage the selection team, which selects and orders everything you can borrow from any of these branches, in addition to the digital collections of both of these libraries. So that's the context for thinking about when we define what we consider a collection gap. We're thinking about all of the patrons that we serve that live in this very diverse set of neighborhoods across these 4 boroughs, anywhere between 6 and 7 million people. We actively select in 21 languages and every single kind of format type, from board book to read along to CD to DVD, and even books in print, which continue to be very popular all across our 4 boroughs. So a known collection gap is a term we use in our office to single out a very particular problem that we've been trying to address for many, many years, actually, and librarians have been trying to address for many, many years. But we've, in the last 5 years, become much more aggressive and focused on how we look at this challenge. So when we say known collection gap, we define that in a couple of different ways. One is this is a topic or a point of view or perspective for which there is known community demand. We're either seeing the demand through circulation data, through patron feedback that comes to us directly, or patron feedback that comes to us through our staff. But at the same time, even though we see the demand for works by somebody from this background or on this particular topic, we can't find any works, or the works we can find are out of date or inaccurate, or we can find a couple, but not nearly enough to meet the demand that we're seeing. Or we also track things when we are able to find titles that do meet this demand, but none within the traditional publishing ecosystem. We have to go far outside the ecosystem in order to purchase them. We have started to track these gaps on an actual list, and we'll continue to note something as a gap even when we see progress, as we have begun to see progress on some of these gaps. But many of them are so deep, and there's so many works are needed to fill them, that just like 1 or 2 publishing seasons worth of a couple more books on these topics is not going to meet the needs that we're seeing. So when we talk about known collection gaps, other libraries might have different ways of labeling this, but this is a pretty common concept and something that librarians who do collections work talk about all the time. And I do want to point out, too, I'm very interested in the history of how collections have been purchased here at NYPL. So I've read a lot of reports from the past, and this is a photo of a report that was written, I believe, in the late 70s, that just gives you a sense for the ways in which this has been a recurring cyclical issue, not just for publishing, but for librarians. You can see, I think, the head of YA services wrote, held some meetings with publishers over our concern about the falling off of titles which serve students' current problems, biographies, Black culture, etc., on a level which young people can handle. And some of those actually continue to be collection gaps today. That's part of why we decided to become more focused and intentional in this work, because we've seen libraries go through this cycle with publishers repeatedly. We identify the gaps in a number of ways. Some of them are through formal diversity auditing, which may be a phrase some of you are familiar with. Our youth selectors, so those who buy material for children and teens, have been diversity auditing the majority of their new book ordering for the last few years. looking at a number of different facets of personal identity and applying them both to the content of the works and also to the creators of the works. So keeping track of that over time is one way you can identify repeated gaps. Others are identified just through selector expertise. A selector may get repeated requests to purchase a certain type of material, do a lot of research and work to try and fill that need, and then after extensive research find that they can't fill that need. That's another way we identify them. And then a third is, as our city changes and as we talk to colleagues around the country who do this work, we also come to see, oh, this isn't just like a one-time thing. This is actually a gap that many of us are identifying. A great example of that would be, I've heard repeatedly from all corners of the country and all of our branches, a need for more nonfiction about Indigenous people and Native Americans written by Indigenous people and Native Americans appropriate for children. It's a curriculum need. Almost everybody gets children and educators coming in looking for this type of information. There's actually very little that we can provide them. And this is a great example too, because we've seen a slight increase in the amount of material we need, but nothing close to what we really need. And here in New York City, we're still waiting for more things on the Lenape, who are the original inhabitants of the land that we live on now. So we track them so we have, as a department, a good understanding of these gaps. We know where to prioritize when things become available or when we have to make decisions about how money's spent. And also it makes us more effective at advocating with publishers and other folks in the book world about what our member libraries need. And as we think about what is a library's role in helping to close some of these gaps, we want to be really clear that anybody in our member libraries has a shared understanding with us. We also, this is something we can use to talk to our branches. A lot of our branch librarians will become frustrated that they can't, for example, find enough bilingual material to meet the needs of their patrons or enough diverse early readers. And tracking these things more formally allows us to have conversations with them about how part of this has to do with what's available to purchase and how to talk to patrons about that. Librarians are in a slightly different position than other folks in the book industry. And I started my career as a bookseller, so I learned how to buy books quite differently. But in the library world, almost every workflow centers around wholesalers or vendors of some sort, and that's been true for a very long time. We don't purchase books for circulation directly from publishers, so we don't use Edelweiss the way that a bookstore might. And we don't use consumer websites either. We don't use Amazon or any publisher websites. We're getting all of our information out of these different wholesaler and vendor websites. So when we're going to fill a collection gap, just like any other kind of buying, we're always starting in those places. I should say too, when we fill collection gaps, part of this is looking for new material and saying to ourselves, okay, we know that these are things we're looking for. As we're ordering new material, let's specifically look for material that will fill these needs that we've documented. But also librarians across the country regularly do something that in our office we call refresh purchasing. There's lots of different words for it. But what that means is going back and buying new copies of older titles for various reasons. Sometimes that might be buying new copies of, say, all the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. We have to refresh that regularly. Copies go missing and get damaged. Other times it might mean going back and looking at big picture. For example, a couple of years ago, I refreshed our parenting section because one, to buy new copies of really popular parenting books that regularly get borrowed and put on hold, but also to think about whether a diverse range of parenting techniques and viewpoints were represented amongst our parenting books. So doing refresh purchasing or trying to make sure we're doing holistic collection development is often a place where we look at these gaps and try to fill them. Another way we fill them, if we can't find everything we need through our traditional workflows with wholesalers and vendors, is doing extensive research, as I talked about, and then looking for maybe small publishers who are selling direct to consumer, or selling directly to their community. Often with children's books, for example, you'll find a small publisher started by a parent who wanted a certain type of representation in books for their children, didn't find it, and started publishing books on their own. A lot of these smaller publishers and independent authors don't work directly with library sales channels because they're targeting consumer channels or retailers in their area. So a lot of times we will go out and find them and try to buy from them directly. But I do want to note this isn't a satisfactory in a 90 number of ways. It's a lot of additional work for our workflows, and also the New York Public Library is able to do this, but many libraries across the country aren't, owing to whatever their municipal finance rules are, or the city they work for or the organization they work for may not allow them to order material from vendors that haven't gone through an approved bid process or been involved in the finance department. So that's something we can do, but it's not something all libraries can do. And then the other way the sort of long-term strategy we have is to make sure we're really direct with the publishers and vendors that we meet with, and to talk to them about what we're looking for and what we can't find. One example, as I mentioned, bilingual books. This is looking for truly bilingual books, born bilingual books, particularly Spanish and English, but any number of other languages is a huge priority for us, especially for children, and it's constantly asked for across both of our systems. And there are a lot of challenges to publishing bilingual books, we recognize, but this was just repeated and kept coming up. So it's something we were very, very deliberate in talking to publishers about at conferences or working with vendors like Vox and Find a Way with the read-along product, and really encouraging them to think about this need. We are finally seeing across a lot of different parts of children's publishing more of the sorts of bilingual books we're looking for. So that as a long-term strategy, we also want to be really clear and advocate for those needs, because most of the folks we serve don't have a way to directly share those needs with the folks who are publishing the books. And I should say too, a lot of the folks who are using library collections and the types of books we're looking for are not books that necessarily do very well in a retail channel, and they're not readers who publishers probably otherwise hear about or have data on. So if you're familiar with how booksellers buy books, you know that a lot of them have a dedicated sales rep or some other support from a publisher or a distributor in which they are guided to find books that work very well for their customers or for their store. Librarians don't have this. We don't have sales reps. There are some really excellent library marketers out there in publishing, provide some amazing resources in terms of webinars and newsletters. But even at the New York Public Library, I don't have sales reps coming to us directly and walking us through the fall catalog and showing us everything. So what we're really using is metadata when we're trying to decide what to buy. Metadata is our sales rep, essentially. We are looking for metadata to tell us what we need to know about a book. This has become even more important since the pandemic, because we used to receive a lot more galleys, FNGs, mailings, things that would let us look at physical books far in advance of publication and assess them on our own. This is less and less frequent, and as I'm sure many people on this call have experienced themselves, reviews have also been coming closer to publication date as well. So we are really depending on metadata to make a lot of the decisions we need to make. We do try to buy new books ahead of publication whenever we can, so that our patrons have access to them on or close to street date. So the metadata really becomes the primary way by which we decide what to purchase. And I should say too, for those who don't know, when libraries order books, we don't just say, oh, I'd like 10 copies, or I'd like 20 copies. We also have to decide at that point which branches those 10 copies are going to go to, and whether we want it cataloged as a biography or a nonfiction book. If it's fiction, is it a romance novel? Is it urban fiction? Is it regular fiction? These are all decisions that we're looking to the metadata. If it's a 10 to 14, our bête noire when it comes to age categories? Are we going to put it in the children's section, or are we going to put it in the teen section? These are all decisions we're using the metadata to make. And so the sorts of things we're looking at are the data that you provide, the folks on the call here who are publishers. So BISAC codes, audience level, description of the content, not just the content, but also the person who created it, reviews, the publication date, the publication status, the cover image and other images. We're gleaning whatever we can out of how the wholesaler and the vendor have put all of this metadata in front of us. But that's a challenge because even though librarians are searchers by nature, there are many, many common metadata errors that get in our way of being able to find these books, to discover them in our normal workflows. And I'll point out some of them so that you can think about how they might apply to you. So BISAC codes are a huge challenge for us. We either find that people are using them incorrectly. So for example, I see a lot of books labeled as urban fiction simply because they are set in a city, which is not what urban fiction is, at least from our perspective, or missed opportunity BISAC codes. Often people will use one very high level BISAC code that doesn't indicate parenting, was one where I ran into this a lot. People weren't in any way using a BISAC code that indicated something was related to child rearing or parenting or children in any way. We also find, depending on what type of book you order, and everybody here has their own specialty, that in books that have multiple formats, they might also have a large print format or a paperback and a hardcover, an ebook, that the BISAC code, title information, any of the metadata is not being consistent across all of the formats, which makes it very hard for us to see whether we've purchased things in multiple formats, or to be sure that the person who purchases books on CD is seeing the same information as the person who purchases that book in print. And it's even more challenging across series. Series are a particular challenge. And this is not just fiction. There's a lot of nonfiction series as well, particularly for children and teens, where the name of the series is not consistent, or it changes over time, or it changes between formats. And that makes it really hard to do this work as well. Knowing whether something is a new edition, whether it's original or a reprint, is something that, frankly, a lot of these things are so inconsistent, we can't actually use them as search strategies. We end up spending a lot of time casting a really wide net with searching, because if you define your search too narrowly, you run the risk of incorrect metadata eliminating books that you'd like to buy. Audience and age level data. Also, a lot of people, like we have missed any number of books because adult selectors have their searches set to only see adult books. Children's and youth selectors only want to see their age level. But if a publisher labels an adult book as a children's book in the audience level, then it just won't show up in a search, or has to be brought up another way. Misuse of the subtitle field really wreaks havoc on our searching and later our cataloging workflows. A shocking number of books that don't have a cover image in wholesalers, even after they've been published. And I would say the sort of number one that I would ask publishers to think about is incomplete content description. So it is not at all uncommon for me to bring up a book in a cart to decide whether I want to purchase it, and there will be maybe a 2-sentence description, nothing about the author, cover image to come, very limited metadata. And if I want to know more about the book, what I have to do is leave my workflow and go look at the same book in Edelweiss, or go look at the same book on Goodreads, or go look at the same book on the publisher's website, where there's often very rich metadata. There's blurbs, there's author bios, there's all sorts of additional information that if I have the time and I'm able to find the book elsewhere, I can get that information, but it's not in the place where I'm ordering the books. And most importantly, if I had searched for any of that information, that book wouldn't have been surfaced in my research. So what can a publisher do about this? Well, I mean, I'm sure you're sick of hearing about this from librarians if you've heard about it before, but metadata is really important. And I know if you're not a metadata person, and Lord knows I'm not a cataloger, that's not the most fun thing to hear, but I would encourage you to think of your metadata as your sales, as a sales channel for librarians, particularly if you're at a small publisher that can't support a huge library marketing team, that the way you put your metadata together in wholesaler and vendor spaces for schools and libraries is the primary way in which we find things. So and often the information we're looking for, many publishers have actually already made available to other channels. So investing in metadata is a good investment in terms of, if you publish things that particularly depend on school and library market sales, this is the primary way we're going to discover and find it. And especially if you are publishing into these gaps. We know a lot of publishers, big and small, are aware of these gaps and are doing work to try and find books to publish for them. But if we don't know that, and I've lost count of the number of times this happened, where an author will directly send us a book to ask us to consider it, and there'll be tons of information about them. They're from New York. They grew up in Washington Heights. They wrote this book that's so relevant to our libraries. We think, how did we miss this the first time? And then we go back and we see, oh, because the cover wasn't here, there was no information about the author being a New Yorker, the BISAC codes were pretty vague. Like, of course we didn't think this was something we should just buy sight unseen. So investing in metadata is the fastest and most reliable way to make these books visible. And you don't have to be an expert in it. I'm not. That's why Brian's here, in case you have questions about Onyx feeds. I can't answer them, but there are a lot of people out there who are. You may already work with some, depending on the size of your publisher, or you may be able to go out and look for help or work with other small publishers or your distributor. But there are many people in the book industry who are really good at this. So ask for help on this. It's a good investment of your time. I think the fastest way to check whether what you're providing is useful to librarians is to compare what's available to a librarian to your other channels. So what is on your consumer-facing website? What's on your social media? what would a retailer at an independent bookstore see about this title if they were logged into Edelweiss, or what are you providing on NetGalley to reviewers? If it's not the same thing, ask yourself why, and think about how you can get that information in these other spaces as well, because it's even more necessary for folks who don't have as much additional support in looking for these titles. And then finally, if you haven't already, take a look at, it's never a bad time to review and document metadata workflows. And this is something we're always doing here as well, is we want to understand publisher workflows better so that we can make sure our workflows are bringing up the books that we want to buy. Think about, are there places where making updates, like loading a new cover image, is somehow only making it into certain parts of your workflow and other parts are being left behind? All sorts of different things. Take a look at who's responsible for each piece, make sure that's clear. And think about, like, do you have, if you publish the same kind of book all the time, have you written down how you listed the series the first time as a continuity check? Do you know which BISAC people are most likely to look for your books for have been successful? Make sure that's reviewed and documented so it can be consistent over time. Just like in publishing, librarians come and go, people move into different jobs or into different roles. And so in order for this work to be effective over time, there needs to be a good documentation of it so that people can keep building on it instead of having to start over. Okay, great. I did leave time for questions at the end, and I see there are some questions. This is just one more great report for you to look at while I am looking at the Q&A. You can see again, I think this goes all the way back to the early 40s, that people are this is another type of book actually that we're still asked for today. Simple, accurate, well-written books, which are not textbooks, but which may introduce the adult reader to new fields of interest. Most frequently, there are no such books. And we still hear this all the time from branches. People want just like a math book. They're like, I just need to remember how to do math. I don't want a biography of calculus. I don't want addition for dummies. I just want like a basic book about math concepts. Why can't you provide that to me? So these are some of these needs have been ongoing, and we're hoping to keep working on filling them. And I would love to hear your questions on how we can better connect and find these books to buy them. Should I just go ahead and look right into the questions?
No, I'll lead you through them.
Okay,
This way you can focus on the question and not really looking at the admin.
Okay.
So Krista was just asking right at the outset that she noted that some of the examples, or maybe the majority of the examples you've given, were for K-12 or perhaps K-8 books, focused on youth and teens. And she was just wondering, is that representative of where you have the most collection gaps, or is that just something that's top of mind right now for you?
No, that's a great question. The reason I have more of those examples is because they've been diversity auditing for a few years, so we have a lot more hard data. There are just as many gaps in adult publishing. The challenge we have there is, as you probably know on this call, there are just more books for adults. So trying to find a meaningful way to do auditing work alongside operational ordering has been a little trickier, but we see just as many gaps for adults. And I would say in teens, because you said K through 8, Brian, we do actually see YA publishing is in some ways faster to close some of these gaps. But a challenge for teens then is that we're seeing more books by a much more diverse range of authors on a much more diverse range of topics, but the overall number of books being published is getting bigger also. So the proportions of publishing have not changed that much. But yeah, there are, and I should say too, there are lots of examples, books in other languages for all ages too. It's not just English language publishing.
Thanks. And Claire is asking, we have a couple questions related to Edelweiss. One, Claire is just saying, that you don't use Edelweiss as you did when you were a bookseller, but she's just wondering, as a librarian, do you still look at it to try and find metadata, or are you working only within the intermediary, the wholesaler distributor workflows?
I mean, I do sometimes, but to be frank, the volume, just in terms of the staffing we have here and the volume of titles we need to assess, it's not realistic. And there's also the way Edelweiss is set up is the way that bookstores buy books, so by publisher and then by season. Librarians are much more likely to buy books by month, and we don't buy by publisher, like we buy by genre or type of nonfiction book or age level. So it's not as though there's like a thing I can open on Edelweiss at the same time. I'm going to have to search for every title individually once I'm in Edelweiss. So it can be useful for some things, but I would say it's just not feasible for it to be part of a librarian's regular workflow to have them both open.
Yeah, and I jumped around a little bit. Lorraine's asking a question that's kind of a limited set, essentially. Because Idolize does exist, it indicates that the publisher metadata does exist. And she's wondering, is this signal that there might be a problem working through the wholesalers? And then a related question is, how could a publisher be sure that wholesalers are receiving and displaying which metadata?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't work for a wholesaler, so I don't know if I can answer, but I would say one, you should ask whoever you work with at a wholesaler, and maybe it's not you, maybe there's someone else at your company who does, to show you maybe what some of your titles look like, or they can explain to you which fields they're drawing from, or what things they're putting in. I also do wonder sometimes, and Brian could speak to this better in terms of how metadata is updated or things are sent out. I often get the sense that there are some channels are getting updates, but not necessarily always the wholesalers that we work with. So I think that's I can really only tell you what it looks like from my end, but I think that's a good thing for people to keep exploring, for librarians and publishers and wholesalers to talk about. There are certainly some types of metadata that are unique to Edelweiss, like say the comp titles and being able to see your sales on comp titles. But in terms of like even something as simple as the description of a book, like I'm often astonished by how many books will have a 1-paragraph description on the wholesaler. And I know they can have more because I've certainly read longer descriptions than the wholesaler. And then the same book will have a massively long content block on Edelweiss. It'll have like multiple descriptions and a blurb thrown in there, and a 1-paragraph author bio, and a lot more descriptive free text content. So maybe that has to do with the fields, and I think that's a good thing to ask about. But yeah, I don't know, Brian, if you have any other specific advice around that.
Well, I think there are we haven't done a study in a while on updates and on across the supply chain. When we did do it, it was a decade ago, and what we found was that there's inconsistencies. The publishers are generally pretty good about putting out updates, but recipients were mixed in how frequently they accept those updates and how quickly they turn them around. But that's old data. It would be worth going back and looking at it again. There's kind of a couple of related questions here that Clark was asking. One was, is there a way for a publisher, or what's the best way for a publisher to see books the way that you do? Is there a resource that shows only the metadata that a typical librarian can see? And then in a similar way, Krista came back and just was talking about, can you put names to the spaces in which librarians are looking for metadata? So, and I think that the answer there is the wholesaler space, but maybe just take those two kind of in tandem.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if there's a resource. I think this would be a good thing to ask a wholesaler about. I just discovered last year through working directly with the Independent Publishers Caucus and chatting with some people there that most people had never logged into Baker and Taylor or Ingram before and seen how their titles displayed there. So I don't know if there's anyone from a wholesaler or library vendor on the call who can speak to if they have a resource available to the publishers they work with to share that information with them. I think that would be helpful. And then, well, I'm sorry, Krista's question was about like what types of data are we looking for there? Is that correct?
Really,
Yeah.
where are you finding gaps? And I think that you talked about how you're working really through I think you named 5 intermediaries, the people that you buy most often directly from. And you're using, and if I understood correctly, you're using their systems to be able to look up books and to see what's available.
Yeah, so for us right now, that'll be Baker and Taylor, Ingram, Midwest Tape, Overdrive, Biblioteca, are probably the ones we're in and out of most day to day. And yeah, and just so folks on this call are aware, part of why we have to do this and we can't use some of these other resources is when we're creating the order, we're also, as I said, we're selecting like 10 copies and 1 copy to this branch, and we're putting in what wholesalers would call a grid, or different words for it, so that all of the information when we order the book, we need all of the information to go with the order of what's going to happen to those books once they're arriving at the library. How should they be cataloged? What fund code should they be paid for? And that's a really fundamental piece of a library workflow. So that's why we don't want to leave that environment too much while we're selecting, because we have to ultimately use the format that we can use through these wholesalers and vendors to put the orders together. And it's even more important for ebooks. We can't buy ebooks outside of the library marketplace, as everyone knows. So, you know, do you have to leave that tab on your browser regularly while you're buying books? Of course, but ideally you're doing it as little as possible. And 2, keep in mind, when you're trying to fill a collection gap, you're searching often directly in these websites to try and do that, and to try and find all the information you need. So,
okay. We're just at 3:30. I have a
yeah.
few more questions. Do you have a few minutes to stay with us and
Sure, yeah.
if you know? Thank you.
Yep.
So Phil and Sarah were asking about the subtitle field, and Phil had just said, can you say a little bit more about misuse? And Sarah said, can you speak more to the correct use? So maybe I put a link in. BISG did put out a statement earlier this year about misuse of the subtitle field. I guess anticipating your objection, but what is it that's happening that troubles libraries?
Well, there's kind of 2 things. The first is that a subtitle is an actual piece of bibliographic data. From our perspective, it is part of the name of the book. The title and the subtitle are names of are part of how a book is identified and described. We're finding more and more publishers are using the subtitle field in what appears to me to be more of an SEO fashion, or a way to try to, I don't even know, maybe one of you can explain it to me, like game Amazon search or make things come up in Google. But so the subtitle won't actually be the name of the book. It will be some descriptive words about the book, like a heart-stopping, pulse-pounding Western romance or something, which is not actually the subtitle of the book. It's not on the title page. It's not part of the copyright information. And we've just seen this, like I know, I'm glad BISG put the statement out, Brian, because it just seems to be creeping in all the weirdest places. And it has 2 problems. One is you'd think it would be helpful when looking at books, but it's not actually helpful because it's not the name of the book. And 2 is it makes a lot of work for our catalogers, because we do try to draw on your data to build catalog records. But if you are describing a book in a way that is inaccurate, that is not actually the name of the book, that becomes the challenge. It's a particular challenge if you do it not only on one format, or like one format has the original subtitle, which is just like a novel, and then the paperback, for some reason you've added all these extra words. It makes it hard to link across all the different formats. So from my perspective, and I think BISG's too, Brian, right? The subtitle is not a marketing opportunity. It is bibliographic description. And so perhaps people are doing this to get around other metadata challenges, but it's in fact causing more metadata headaches from our perspective.
Yeah, I think we're pretty aligned on that. And part of the reason that we did want to put it out was to get at the downstream uses and complications. The libraries are not the only folks who are struggling with this.
Yeah.
The Adam is asking about are you making any use of thema codes? These are the non-North American descriptors for the parallel BISAC, or are you working primarily from BISAC for subject categories?
We're working primarily with BISAC. I think the other the other classification categories that come up are library subject headings, which a lot of wholesalers will proactively apply, or if you're doing refresh buying, I think wholesalers will often pull known subject headings like out of the Library of Congress or WorldCat data. But so the 2 main things we're looking at are Library of Congress subject headings and BISAC. And I suppose in some cases, a Dewey number, but I think that's often assigned by the wholesaler. I don't think publishers are guessing at Dewey numbers. So
Adam also asks, and I think you probably want to tread carefully on this. Do some wholesalers have better UIs than others? Meaning that if the metadata is the same, do you have an easier time kind of parsing it. I'd prefer that you not name names, at least
No,
not in
I
the
will.
public's.
No, I'm not. This is being recorded, and I would say it is accurate to say there, and I think if I have anyone from my team is on the call, they would tell you certainly nobody has the market cornered on an effective UI that works really well for us. So we see things that we like in all of these different vendor and wholesaler websites, but I think there's room for improvement across the board.
Yeah,
For sure.
and one of the projects we have ongoing over the next 2.5 years at a minimum is transforming supply chain communications. So you've given us another thing to add to that plate. The Hannah was making the observation that she's speaking from an ebook and audiobook perspective, that you can see how your metadata appears to library users and librarians by going to the library and user sites. So distributors such as Overdrive have publisher portals where you can view your file with relevant metadata. So that might be a vehicle for some of the folks who are looking to at least get an operating sense of what you're looking at.
And I will say too, Brad, that's a place if a publisher does it, that ebooks are a place where inaccurately applied age level or audience level is a real challenge, because that can have very serious downstream effects in terms of patron access. During 2020 in particular, where we were like knee deep in buying ebooks, we would see that a publisher had labeled something that was obviously a children's book, they had inadvertently labeled it as an adult book, and the vendors aren't necessarily going to unilaterally make that change because it's publisher metadata. And in the case of, the way certain libraries or schools might have settings, they're looking at that audience and age level for digital material to restrict material or allow parents or educators the ability to restrict material. So looking at a publisher portal like that can be really helpful if you want to be sure that your book is actually being accessed by the age level that you intended it to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's not quite metadata 101, but it is an important part of the consideration. Consistency, as you pointed out, is sometimes the hobgoblin of book sales.
Yes.
Or I guess inconsistency. I just want to pick this up. Michael Santangelo, who you know a little bit, has answered it already, but Ellis was asking if a book comes out as trade paperback original, do librarians tend to skip over them if a hardcover isn't available? And Michael points out that you actually love paperback originals and do not skip over them.
We love a paperback original. I think it's actually trickier for us sometimes when it's a simultaneous publication. We're constantly talking about which to buy, but especially in urban libraries, paperbacks are very attractive to commuters or to folks who don't have a ton of room in their bag. We make different decisions based on budget or who we think the end user is most likely to be, but trade paperbacks, or even those poor old mass markets, which seem to slowly be fading away, we buy those too. If the content can circulate, we will buy it in a format that we can buy it in. And I think maybe a very long time ago, librarians were less partial to paperbacks, but at this point, I don't think any library wouldn't buy a trade paperback original.
All right. Well, if I can borrow 2 more minutes of your time. Travis was asking, you mentioned a lot of misuse of BISACs. Is there a database or document that gives a definition or example for each BISAC? And I think the answer you would agree was no.
No.
There's no standard definition, and it's something the metadata committee, the subject codes committee, who maintains the BISAC code list for us, thinks about. I mean, it's a lot of work. Everybody who works on that list is volunteering their time, so we recognize it as potentially a gap. But there are also currently about 5,400 codes, so defining each one of them unambiguously, it would be a project. So, Edson was asking if you find gaps that differ by format, meaning do you have known collection gaps that are in ebooks or in print or in audio?
That is a great question. Yeah, it does differ by format, and they're not, I couldn't even say consistently one way or the other. For example, there are many gaps that exist in large print that don't exist in regular print. There are, in ebooks, we have the challenge of a lot of ebooks that are quite popular but aren't for sale on the library market, and so we can't purchase them, even if, like, particularly looking, as I mentioned earlier, looking for small publishers and self-published work. that meets our selection criteria is so far been a key part of our strategy to improve representation and diversity in the library collection. But many of those folks don't know how libraries are different from the rest of the marketplace when it comes to ebooks, and don't offer their books through that channel to us. And then likewise, there are some backlist titles which are only available in print and haven't yet been digitized for one reason or another. So, and then when it comes to languages, bilingual work, but then also there are, because most of what we buy in other languages comes from other countries, we are able to buy it and import it from other countries in print, but there are very different legislative and technical reasons why that isn't always true digitally. So it's definitely different all over the place, for sure.
The one last question for you, which is how far in advance are you looking for titles to have their metadata populated for purchasing? Trade bookseller might be up to 6 months ahead of time. How about for libraries?
I think it really depends on the library. So I'm going to speak very broadly because this has everything to do with how you're funded and how your bills get paid and any number of different things. Our librarians tend to purchase more like 2 to 3 months before publication, and you'll see that in many libraries because we would like to see a review for a particular, especially some types of books like children's nonfiction or any nonfiction, you're looking for some kind of review. But I know many libraries that will purchase 6 to 9 months in advance, or will purchase some material further ahead, like your very popular authors like your John Grishams or your Colson Whiteheads. You don't really need that much of a review to know you're buying it for the library. You might buy that further ahead, and then wait for other types of material. But again, that'll vary quite widely. But I think if you're having it updated for 6 months for the retail channel, I think that is an effective timeline to consider for libraries as well, because we're going to be all over the map based on how our money comes in.
Well, shout out to Colson Whitehead. He's got a free pass at BookOps.
Anytime. He can come by anytime, yes.
There are a number of comments in the chat that kind of just thank you for the time that you've given us today. Let me add to them by saying that both the materials you prepared and the clarity and the directness of the answers you provided, I think, give us the motivation to continue to work on this and to see what we can do to make metadata and overall content discovery workflows make sense for libraries, because it's an important channel for books in the industry, and we'd like to make them work better.
Yeah, great. Thank you all for listening. Yeah, look, we want to buy your books. We're trying to buy them, so please help us find them. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll see you at the next
Thanks.
workflow committee call.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.